Thank you very much, Catherine, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for inviting me back to the Sign Lab. Sad that it couldn't be face to face, but it's really nice to be able to join everyone virtually from the UK. I wasn't able to make it into the office, so I'm joining you from my lovely dressing room / office that we developed for during COVID. So my talk today, I'm going to talk to you about one area of my research which uses the social identity approach to understand psychosis. And I'll start by giving you a little bit about my background, even though some of you already know it. I'll talk about a theoretical model of social identity and paranoia, some of the research on the psychological mechanisms associated with the relationship between social identity and paranoia, and then some research we've done on student mental health using these ideas, buffering hypothesis that was examined by my previous PhD student, and then also some work that we've done with Fiona Barlow, who I see is here today. Good to see you, Fiona, on the role of social contact and social identity in paranoid symptoms. And so very briefly, I did all my undergraduate studies and postgraduate studies at the University of Queensland. And there you can see it on a lovely, crisp autumn morning. And then I was fortunate enough to be offered a postdoctoral position at the University of Liverpool. And so I made the move from Brisbane to Liverpool. There's me off to my first day at work at the University of Liverpool. But it was a really, really enjoyable experience doing that postdoc. And now and that postdoc was on health inequalities. And then I'm now a lecturer at Liverpool John Moores University, focusing on mental health. So I did my PhD in social psychology and then sort of gradually moved more into the mental health field. And so just some definitions. Social identity, I'm sure you're all familiar with, our sense of self derived from our group memberships. The other concept I'm going to be talking about today is paranoia, which is the most common symptom of psychosis, and that is believing that people want to deliberately harm you in the absence of credible evidence that that's true. And another concept that's relevant to the research is auditory verbal hallucinations, another common symptom of psychosis, which is hearing a voice or voices in the absence of any auditory stimulus. And in the context of psychosis, often those voices are saying negative and mean things. And so this was where this research started. So this is a theoretical model of social identity and paranoia, where we outlined mainly the overall link between social identity and how it might link to symptoms of paranoia, but also some of the social and psychological mechanisms that we propose would explain this relationship between social identity and symptoms of paranoia. And so we published this in 2016 with my colleagues Adam Elahi and Richard Bentel. Adam Elahi's at the University of Liverpool and Richard Bentel from University of Sheffield. And we also wrote about it for the conversation and applied this to the mental health of immigrants and people from ethnic minority groups as well. And one of the first questions we wanted to answer was whether social identity was first related to paranoia, because this hadn't really been studied in the past, and what are the psychological factors that might explain that relationship between social identity and paranoia. And so a prime candidate for our first mechanism to look at was self-esteem. And so there was quite a bit of research suggesting that self-esteem was important for symptoms of paranoia. People with paranoid symptoms tend to have particularly low levels of self-esteem, but also more recent research found that self-esteem is very unstable in relation to symptoms of paranoia. And I won't go into this in detail for this short talk, but it seems to be related to the fact that paranoia may be a defense mechanism against low self-esteem and may protect people from low self-esteem. Hence, you get these fluctuations. Similarly, we also knew that there was lots of research linking social identity with self-esteem. Groups provide us with a positive sense of self, according to Tajfel and Turner's original theory, and there's been lots of subsequent evidence to support the idea that when we feel connected to groups, that it boosts our self-esteem and also our collective self-esteem as well. And so we started looking at these effects. So this study was using a large data set from a community study that we did as part of my postdoc of about 3,500 participants. And we were fortunate enough to have measures of identity, self-esteem, and paranoia in this data set. And so we adjusted for various confounds that we thought might affect this relationship, such as demographics and socioeconomic status. And we also controlled for comorbid symptoms of depression and anxiety to see if these effects were unique to paranoia. And so we did find this mediated effect where people who felt a strong sense of identity, in this case, it was with their local neighborhood. So people who had a strong neighborhood identity tended to have higher self-esteem. And this in turn was linked to lower levels of paranoia. And so there was evidence that this self-esteem may be important in this identity paranoia relationship. As part of this study, we also had measures of auditory verbal hallucinations in the data set. And so this research also helped us identify the specificity of this effect. And we didn't predict that identity would be related to auditory verbal hallucinations. The research seemed to suggest that social factors are more likely to influence paranoia than they are auditory verbal hallucinations. And again, this isn't fully understood either, although auditory verbal hallucinations tend to be less linked to social factors. And a lot of research seems to suggest that it's more likely to be related to structural brain changes, such as differences in connectivity in different parts of the brain, such as the hippocampus, for example, which people have argued suggest there might be more genetic biological underpinnings. But of course, our brain structure can also be affected by social factors as well. But we didn't find any relationship between neighborhood identity and auditory verbal hallucinations in our study. We didn't find a link between self-esteem and auditory verbal hallucinations in our study either. So it seemed to be specific to paranoia. And we also sort of replicate previous research as well and find similar links to depression and anxiety as well. So it seems to be more similar to symptoms of anxiety and depression than it does to auditory verbal hallucinations. So those effects there that I reported were unstandardized. So just to give you an idea of sort of what sort of effect sizes we're talking about for the link with paranoia. This was data from a student sample where we looked at different identities in this sample. The strongest relationship with paranoia was friendship group identity, so people identifying with their university friends. That seemed to be the most important group for university students, and this was significantly related to lower levels of paranoia with a correlation of -0.25, and these effects seem to be comparable to symptoms of depression where we see relationships with 0.31. So that's where the effect size seemed to be. There was a relationship with auditory verbal hallucinations of 0.1, but this effect went away when we added the covariates into the model. And then in terms of the mediated effect for depression, we find that 23% of that total effect is mediated through self-esteem. For paranoia, it was 17%. So generally, slightly smaller effects than what we see with depression for symptoms of paranoia. And so I think this is one of those tables you're not meant to present, but maybe it works better on Zoom and you can see some of the numbers. But yes, this is just to give you an idea of how many different variables we looked at in this student mental health study. And again, we had quite a large sample. I think it was about 1,700 students we had in this data set. And we just looked at a whole range of different social determinants and socio-demographic characteristics that might be associated with different mental health symptoms. I think I've got the one for depression here rather than paranoia, but the effects again were very similar for paranoia. I don't think I had a screenshot of my paranoia one, but very similar effects. And we see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but when we enter the different identity variables here, you can see that university friends identity is the most important predictor of mental health. But if you look at the final model here, one interesting thing that jumps out is that loneliness is by far the most important predictor of depression. And again, we found the same thing for paranoia, but also that the effect of university friends identity goes to zero when you've got loneliness in the model. So there's a lot of overlapping variance there between loneliness and university friends identity, which suggests that university friends are really important for reducing loneliness among students and improving people's mental health. And yeah, we found other significant effects related to childhood trauma was particularly important for predicting mental health among students. And we also found sexuality discrimination was significant as well, even controlling for all these other stresses and socio-demographic characteristics. But I think loneliness still showing a relationship of 0.42 with all those other factors in the model is a fairly strong effect that loneliness and social connection is really important for university students. So because we were doing a lot of work with inequalities, we were interested in financial stress as a predictor of mental health. And so this was work that we did with my PhD student at the time, Anam Alahi, who is now Dr. Anam Alahi, looking at whether a sense of community belonging can reduce the risk of mental health problems associated with economic adversity. And so this was essentially a stress buffering hypothesis, looking at these stresses and seeing whether identity could help buffer people for them. Again, we looked at multiple symptoms, paranoia, depression, and anxiety in these studies. And so what we did was we tested our mediated effect to see if we could replicate that in the earlier studies, but we also tested to see if we had a moderation with neighborhood identity. Could identifying with your local area disrupt this pathway from financial stress to worse mental health? And that is indeed what we found. So for people who didn't have a strong sense of belonging with their local area, we found a significant relationship between financial stress and worse mental health that was mediated through self-esteem. For people who did have a strong sense of neighborhood identity, we didn't have a significant effect of financial stress on mental health through self-esteem. So it did seem to buffer people from the negative effects of financial stress on mental health symptoms. And so that applied to paranoia and depression and anxiety. And it replicated for neighborhood identity with our community sample, and it was city or town identity for our university sample. So identifying with the city or the town where you're attending university buffered people from the effects of financial stress on mental health symptoms. And then following on from this, we did some work with a sample of people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So we had funding to do a study with people from African and African Caribbean backgrounds who are, again, are a high-risk group for mental health symptoms and particularly psychosis. And so here, we were again interested in the psychological mechanisms, but also interested in the role of social contact. And so this was the study that my colleague and previous PhD supervisor, Nabarlo, was part of. And so we wanted to see whether there was an interest between people's identity and the type of social contact that they had within group members. And so we measured whether people from African and African Caribbean backgrounds identified with Great Britain, the extent to which they identified with Great Britain. But we also measured their levels of positive and negative contact with white British people to see if this affected the relationship between their identification with Great Britain and symptoms of paranoia. And so what we found was that the relationship between identity and paranoia depended on what kind of contact people had with white British people, and we could actually reverse that effect depending on the type of social contact that people had. So if people from African Caribbean backgrounds had a strong identity or a strong identification with Great Britain, and they had positive contact with white British people, this was associated with lower levels of paranoia. If people had strong British identities but had mostly negative contact with people, with white British people, then this was actually associated with higher paranoia. So in this case, identification could actually be harmful to people's mental health when it was combined with negative contact with, in this case, in-group members, people who were from Great Britain, but they were white British people. And so this showed that, yeah, you could actually have increased paranoia depending on the social context. We also found that this moderated effect was not at all mediated through self-esteem, okay, which was interesting because we did expect to see this effect and predicted this effect to be mediated through self-esteem and locus of control, but all of this effect was mediated through locus of control. So it seemed to be that this combination of identifying with Great Britain but having negative experiences with white British people made people feel less in control of their lives. And this was explaining a lot of the relationship between identification and paranoia. Not all of the relationship, again, there's probably other mediators associated with this relationship, but locus of control was the most important in this model. Got through this quicker than I thought. And so, yeah, so in terms of funding and future work, as Alex and Kath know, didn't have much luck with a large grant that we submitted to the ESRC. And so, yes, of the nearly £900,000 of funding I've submitted for this social identity and psychosis research, I've been awarded a grand total of £2,000. And even worse than that, every time I submit a funding application that doesn't focus on social identity, it gets funded, which limits my ability to do this work. So it's not progressing as fast, this stream of work, as I would like it to, purely because I don't have the time and funding to get it. But we have had some bad luck with this funding. I think the ESRC bid was rated, I think, outstanding by 3 of our 4 reviewers. And then we did have a recent bid as well, where it was during COVID and they ended up changing the funding rules after everyone had submitted their applications, and it was rated outstanding again. So it hasn't dissuaded me from focusing on this kind of work. And people familiar with Nyla Branscom's work has probably be pleased to hear it's actually solidified my commitment to continue this work and apply for funding. And what we want to do in the future is there's really no qualitative work on this area, particularly qualitative work with people from vulnerable groups, people from ethnic minority backgrounds. So that's something I'd like to do in the future. There's no research either working with clinical samples with people with severe symptoms, and also looking at clinician perspectives as well of the links between identity and symptoms of psychosis. We obviously want to translate this research into interventions and then do intervention evaluations. But again, these are the large projects that need funding to sort of progress the research to that sort of level. Yeah, so I think that's all of that stream of research. So to sum up, what we found is that paranoia seems to be a response to stressful circumstances and threat to one's sense of self. If you feel feeling like you belong is associated with higher self-esteem and seems to disrupt the pathway from stresses to paranoia in the same way it does to other symptoms like depression and anxiety. And for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, the relationship between social identity and paranoia depends on your social experiences. It can actually have a positive effect or a negative effect on paranoia depending on your social experiences. And so that's where we are at the moment. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions or comments, they would be most welcome.